Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be a mid-month wrap-up, so I'll just go ahead and talk about the books that I've read up to this point in time in the month of March. Let's get into it. So far up to this point in time, I've read 9 books in the month of March, and they've all been fiction books. I am currently reading one nonfiction book, and it's super interesting, but I actually don't know if I'll be able to finish it this month. And it is called The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness by Megan O'Rourke. Super interesting, but I'm only about 20% in. In general, I tend to read nonfiction books a lot slower than fiction books, which makes sense because I feel like I'm processing a lot more information, and nonfiction books are usually learning opportunities for me. So, anyways, let's start off with books that I've already mentioned in other videos. If you want more detailed thoughts, please go ahead and watch the dedicated vlog that I made where I read books by Irish authors. I have 2 books to mention in this category. The first one is a short story. It is called Foster, and it is by Clare Keegan. I did end up giving this short story 4 stars. It's a very quick read. I believe the audiobook was about an hour and 30 minutes long. So I finished it within the span of a day as I was taking breaks from work. So in Foster, we have this girl who at the beginning of the book is dropped off by her father at the house of 2 strangers without any context. He just leaves, he doesn't even say goodbye, and he doesn't tell her when he'll be back for her. And she's like, oh, okay, I don't know what to expect, and I've never met these people before, but I guess that's okay. So over the course of a few weeks, she starts to get to know these people that are providing her with basic necessities like shelter, but also human connection and affection. And we also get to learn more about the girl's background. We know that she belongs to a family that has a lot of children, and because of that, her needs are not always met. Her family's also very poor, and so a lot of times when they bathe, they have to share water because they don't have enough money or resources for everybody to be able to have their own hot shower. And so we follow her as she becomes a child again, and she stops to worry about things that she shouldn't need to worry about as a child. The 2 people that she ends up with don't have any children of their own, and so they really focus all of their attention on her and buy her new clothes and make sure that she doesn't have to worry about anything. It was a really interesting read for me because I could tell that there were so many different layers to the story, but I couldn't pick up on everything. There were some words and phrases that were used that were pertinent to like Irish dialect that as an American I wasn't able to pick up on. And then there was also, the context of living in Ireland and in a rural setting in Ireland. So those were also things that I didn't quite pick up on, but it was still such a quiet and reflective read for me. Definitely pick up more books by Clare Keegan moving forward. I had to change the angle because the light is coming in and was shining directly in the camera's face, and I don't think you could see me. So the next book that I ended up reading for that particular vlog is called Panenka. This is by Rónán Hession, and this is a contemporary fiction book, which was quite the ride because I really had no idea what I was diving into. It's a book that I didn't quite know how to feel about right at the beginning. I would say that during the first 30% of the book, I was I just kept wondering where this book was going. We do follow this man named Joseph, who was dubbed the name Panenka. So this takes place in a small town, an unnamed small town in Ireland that has a local soccer team called Sadeqa FC. And this town is very passionate about their soccer. It sort of engulfs the town. It's the one thing that they rally against. And Joseph played for Sadeqa FC until one day something goes terribly wrong and his life sort of spirals from there. For any soccer fans, if you know what Panenka means, you can guess what that event was. So we do follow Joseph leading up to this event, and then several years afterwards when he's living with his daughter and his grandson, and he has divorced his wife. And then we also get insights into his daughter's life and insights into the town. And what I really liked about it, which I thought was really refreshing, was learning about Joseph through the eyes of other people. I feel like something that's really common in American fiction is the individualistic lens and really getting an entire history of a person from when they're young, the nature versus nurture type of thing, and how everything in their childhood affected them. But in Panenka, we get insights into Joseph, not just based on his perception, but also the town and the atmosphere of the town and the people around him. So I just thought that was really refreshing. Even though the story was about Panenka, it was also about this community and how this particular town has shaped him and the residents that live there. I really much enjoyed it. I think during the vlog I gave it a 4.5, but the more that I think about it, I think it's going to be a 5-star read. The next two books that I'm going to mention are books where I have a physical copy. The first one of those is Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. This is a contemporary romance novel, and it was a 5-star read for me. I actually listened to it through audiobook. I requested a copy from my library, but I loved it so much, I went out and bought myself a copy. And actually, I ended up buying another book by Abby Jimenez. It's one of her backlist titles. Life's Too Short, I believe it's called. And I also read her newest release because I did get an advanced reader art. So anyways, Part of Your World. In Part of Your World, we're following Alexis and Daniel. Is that his name? Yeah. So Alexis is driving back from a funeral and she passes through this very small town. As she is driving through this small town, there's a raccoon that just randomly cuts across the street and she swerves out of the way in order to avoid hitting the raccoon, which damages her car. So she's stuck out here and this random guy ends up pulling up next to her. And at first I was like, what the heck is going on? Because it honestly sounded like the beginning of a thriller. When a girl ends up at the side of the road in a very small town, secluded area, and then a man comes to her window and she goes missing. That's what the vibes of this were giving. And I was like, did I pick up the right book? Like, what's going on? It's not a thriller, it's a romance. So this guy named Daniel is the mayor of the town that she got stuck in. He basically ends up helping her out, and Alexis stops for food in that town because she's really hungry and there's nothing for miles. So she ends up at this bar where the locals tend to gather, and a lot of the single men of the town are taking bets like, ooh, I bet I can take her home and I can ask her out, yada, 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 yada. So Daniel, on his way home, ends up letting her know, by the way, you might be in trouble. These guys are going to ask you out, just so you know. And he's like, well, what if I leave with you? And that ends up happening. She goes home with him. They have sex and they have a really, really, really good time. And then she finds out that he is a lot younger than she is. So this is an age gap romance. He's in his mid-20s, I believe, and she's in her mid-30s, something along those lines. Alexis is an ER doctor and she belongs to a very wealthy and prominent family. And Daniel is from this very small town, but he also belongs to a family that has made a lot of impact and really helped out the people of this town. We do follow them as they're trying to navigate this no strings attached, only sex relationship. Alexis isn't looking to have a boyfriend or get very serious with anybody. She just came out of a very toxic and emotionally abusive relationship, and she's still dealing with the aftermath of that. So she doesn't want to get serious with anybody. What I really loved about this book was primarily their relationship and the banter that they had. It was very cute, it was very fun, it was very lighthearted. This is more of like a closed doors romance, so there's not a lot of smut. If you're someone who doesn't like that, it's really more about the interactions that they have with each other. Another thing that I really like is that even though it is very lighthearted and fluffy and funny, there's also some really heavy topics that Abby Jimenez tackles in this, and she handles them in a very sensitive way. I think she has sensitivity readers and she does a lot of research before her book is published. So I really like the combination of those elements. There's also really cute farm animals. There's this cute little goat that makes an appearance. So if you like animal companions or books that have animals in them, this is also really, really, really good. Yeah, it just hits everything that I think I like in romances. And actually, it's this book that gave me insights into the types of romance books that I really like. So 5 out of 5, highly recommend. The next book that I ended up finishing in the month of March is A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin. There's a couple of people here on BookTube who are doing a read-along of A Song of Ice and Fire. I will leave down the discussion video for A Clash of Kings and the announcement video down below. This was technically the book for February, but I didn't finish it until March 2nd or something like that. And this is the second book to A Song of Ice and Fire. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with George R.R. Martin or A Game of Thrones, this is an epic fantasy series. Would this be considered grimdark? Hmm. I think this might be considered grimdark, but if I'm wrong, please let me know. There's a lot of politics involved, a lot of fighting, war. We have very morally great characters. Actually, a lot of the characters in this series do really, really, really terrible and awful things. And George R.R. Martin does such a great job at getting you to empathize with these characters. And if not empathize, at least understand where they're coming from, which is something that I really like to explore, the morality of characters. And so in this particular book, we're following one of the characters named Tyrion. This is his book. He has the most chapters, and he's one of my favorite characters to follow because he plays the game. In the first book, we followed another character whose morality is very solid, and he always chooses to do the right thing, which didn't end up working out for him. And in this, we have the opposite of that. We have Tyrion, who is willing to play the game and save his ass and save himself. I gave A Clash of Kings 4 stars. The only reason for that is because I didn't like the point of view from one particular character. I don't like him. I don't like reading from his perspective. I don't like being in his head. He's so misogynistic. He's so entitled. I've already watched the show, so I have an idea of what's coming. I know that the show started to deviate from the books around A Clash of Kings and A Storm of Swords, which I will be reading next. I think I know what's coming, but yes, that was A Clash of Kings, 4 stars. The next book that I ended up reading in the month of March was an advanced reader arc that I received from NetGalley. This is Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez. This book will be published April 11th, and it's in the same universe or town as Part of Your World. In Yours Truly, we're actually following Brianna Ortiz, who is Alexis's best friend in Part of Your World. And when I tell you that I was so excited to read this, one, we have a Salvadorian or Latina main character. She is so funny. Every single time that she came up in Part of Your World, I die. Like, she's so funny. And the humor continues in this book. She's also so relatable. And the premise of this book is that Brianna is in a precarious situation in her life. She finally finalized her divorce, and she's starting to heal from the trauma of that. But then her brother is still looking for a kidney transplant because he's in a very late stage suffering from renal kidney failure, I believe is what it's called. And so her brother sort of gives up and he's going through depressive episodes, not really fighting for his life anymore. And he moves in with Brianna. That way she can take care of him. Now, the one thing that she can look forward to that is giving her a distraction is that she is running for the chief position as an ER doctor. However, that is possibly tainted when a new ER doctor named Jacob transfers over from a different hospital. And the first meeting between them doesn't go really well. Brianna can't stand him and she can't see how they can work together until he writes her this very sweet letter. Now, Jacob, on the other hand, moved hospitals because his ex-girlfriend just got engaged to his brother and they work at the previous hospital he was in. So he's looking at this as a brand new start. He just wants to leave it all behind. However, he struggles with a lot of social anxiety and he's under a lot of stress and under a lot of pressure. And he feels like everything is going wrong and that no one is really on his side. So when he has that terrible encounter with Brianna, who everybody loves at the hospital, he's like, hey, let me sit down, write her a letter, and apologize and see where it goes. And eventually they start to fake date, and it goes on from there. I ended up giving Yours Truly 4.5 stars. It has those same elements that I really enjoyed from Part of Your World. We have really funny banter and really good chemistry between Brianna and Jacob. Like, their chemistry is so, 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 so good. You can tell right off the bat that they're falling in love with each other. It does get a little bit cheesy at some points, which was a little too much for me. Don't get me wrong, I like the cheese. We have to tax the cheese, you know, there's a cheese tax. I really do think that the second half of the book is a lot stronger than the first half of the book because we really get to know our characters a lot more and we get to root for them. We also have Jacob's family, who is hilarious, and we also get to meet Brianna's mom, who just reminded me of my grandma. I love her. This book also has those heavy topics that Abby Jimenez tends to include in her books, but again, I think they're handled in a very sensitive way. The only other thing that I would add is that the beginning felt a little bit repetitive, and I think that's because Abby is anticipating that there's been some time since people read part of your world and jumped into yours truly, and she's trying to remind you who Alexis and Daniel are and how they fit into this story and just provide background. I read them back to back, so I already knew, so that felt a little bit repetitive, but I still really enjoyed it. And if you're looking for a book with a Latina main character, highly recommend this one. It was very good. The next book that I ended up finishing in the month of March is a thriller, and that is Wonderland by Jennifer Hillier. Jennifer Hillier is a repeat author to me. I ended up reading Things We Do in the Dark. Oh gosh, maybe was it back in 2021? Was it 2022? I can't remember. So Wonderland is one of her backlisted titles. It was published originally in 2015. So it's being re-released as an audiobook April 11th. So I did get an arc of it through NetGalley and I ended up giving it 4 stars. Now, I was a little bit hesitant going into it because any thriller that was published before, I don't know, 2019, 2018, I kind of brace myself for because I've noticed that some of them handle topics in either a really insensitive way or they're plagued with misogyny, racism, and just a bunch of other microaggressions. So I was like bracing myself when I went into it, but it wasn't cringy. Well, there were some cringy parts, some outdated parts, but for the most part, it was a pretty, I don't want to say breezy read. You know what I mean? Like, it didn't have too much content that felt outdated. So, Wonderland is a multi POV thriller set in a small town. It's actually set in the Pacific Northwest, which I was really excited about because I live in Portland, Oregon. This is set in a town called Seaside, which is in Washington, and it's mostly, I would say, a very slow-paced crime thriller. So if you don't enjoy reading from a detective's perspective, and if you don't like slow-moving thrillers, I don't think that this one's going to work out for you. It does pick up in the last 20% of the book, but the majority of it is a little bit slow. It does have really small chapters that end on a little bit of a hook to kind of keep you engaged and to want to keep you reading. So in this one, the premise of it is that there is this amusement theme park called Wonderland, and it's one of the oldest and the biggest theme park in the Pacific Northwest, and it's also a place where boys keep going missing. Now we have a new detective coming in called Vanessa Castro. She was previously a detective for Seattle PD, and now she's moving to Seaside to become the, I don't know, I don't know titles very well. The deputy police chief in Seaside after a tragic accident happened in Seattle. She comes here and she moves here with her daughter, and as soon as she gets there, there is a man who is found dead at the amusement park and another boy who has gone missing. And from there, she starts to investigate the town and also the theme park, and she starts to uncover a bunch of secrets, a lot of cover-up. Yeah, I would say that this was a really fun read for me. I personally love multi-POV thrillers, and I also do like getting the perspective from a detective, especially if those detectives are actually doing their jobs and actually asking questions and following up. Like, the perspective of a really competent detective is something that I quite enjoy. Some of the things that detracted from the book, I would say, is that there's this romance that pops up. And actually, she writes a very steamy scene in here, which, okay, I didn't know that she could write steamy scenes, but it just felt a little bit forced, the romance. Like there's these two characters that hook up and literally a few days go by and this guy's like, "Oh, I want to settle down with her. She's the one that I want." And that seems weird. Like, you don't even know her very well. You just hooked up. Anyways, so I didn't like that. I guess another thing that I would add is that a lot of people see the cover of the Wonder Wheel and they think that it's going to have really creepy vibes and it's going to be like this very ominous amusement park sort of feel. And I mean, that is an element of this book, but I would definitely say it reads more of like a dark fiction book with heavy elements of a procedural. So if you're expecting like this very creepy amusement park scenario, that's not what you're going to get. So yeah, that was Wonderland by Jennifer Hillier. The next book that I ended up reading in the month of March was a highly anticipated read for me, and that is The House of Eve by Sadeqa Johnson. I ended up reading Yellow Wife last year actually, early 2022, and I really like her storytelling and the way that she writes books. So I knew that I had to pick this one up. And I would actually say if you're new to Sadeqa Johnson and if you like historical fiction, highly recommend to check out her books. But I would actually recommend to start out with this one versus The Yellow Wife. The only reason for that is because of the content. The Yellow Wife has some pretty disturbing, gruesome, dark content. It's very heavy. There were several times where I had to put it down and process and be okay before picking it back up again. So The House of Eve, I'm happy to report it did not disappoint. I gave it 4.5 stars. So in The House of Eve, we are following two separate points of views. Both of them are set in the 1950s and run parallel to each other, and we don't know how or if they will ever cross and interact. All I will say about that is that it was a very satisfying end. So in our first narrative, we are following Ruby, who is a 15-year-old girl who wants to be the first person in her family to attend a university. And she is on track to be able to do that. She entered this program. It's an accelerated program that if you complete it, you have the option to receive a scholarship in order to be able to afford it. And apart from that, it provides, the resources that you need to be successful. Now, Ruby is a young Black girl, and this is set during the 1950s, so just prior to the civil rights movement. And she ends up falling in love not only with a white Jewish guy, but with the son of their landlord. So things get a little bit dicey. Now, in the other perspective, we're following Eleanor, and Eleanor is already enrolled into Howard University, which is historically a Black research university located in Washington, D.C. And Eleanor is really excited to be here. I believe she was first going to study literature, but then she meets a librarian who is working on archiving and sorting Black history and making it more accessible. And she's like, this is something that sounds really cool. And so she switches her major. But Eleanor also doesn't belong to a wealthy family, even though she is attending this university. She has to work part-time in order to pay for books and her housing and food, etc. And at her part-time job in the library, she ends up meeting William, who belongs to a very wealthy Black family. And Eleanor needs to learn how to navigate the complexities of being associated not only with a wealthy Black family, but a wealthy white passing Black family when she is a dark-skinned Black woman. Like I mentioned, these two timelines may or may not come together. I really enjoyed both of the narratives, but I definitely think that Eleanor's narrative was a tad bit more compelling. There were some characters in Ruby's life that I wish I had learned more about, but overall, it was just such a well-constructed historical fiction novel, and I learned a lot more about the 1950s, which is an era that I don't often read more about. So if you like historical fiction and you haven't checked out this book, I'd definitely recommend it. So the last two books that I ended up reading in the month of March, I briefly touched on during my previous video of books by Latina and Latino authors that will be coming out in March. I did receive advanced reader copies for these books, and they're both young adult fantasy books. The first one that I ended up reading is The Witch and the Vampire, and this is by Francesca Flores. Now, The Witch and the Vampire is a loose retelling of Rapunzel, or rather obtangled, in that we have this girl who has very long, beautiful hair. She's a witch and a vampire, and she has been locked in her room for years by her mother while her mother siphons off her magic. And so, to put that into context, this is not just a young adult fantasy book, it also has elements of romance. So, there is an enemies, well, technically friends to enemies to lovers romance that does take up quite a chunk of the book. I wouldn't say it's central, but our two protagonists are very central to the plot line. Therefore, the relationship that they have is central, if that makes sense. So we have Ava and we have Kai. I listened to the audiobook and that's how her name is pronounced, so I'm going to move forward with that. And they were really good friends growing up. They live inside of a town that has a magical barrier around it to prevent vampires from coming into the town. Now, there's one night where vampires get through, which seems to be a pretty common occurrence, and there are people who patrol the gate to make sure that vampires are not coming through. That night, they do get through, and Kai's mom ends up dying, and they find evidence that it was a vampire who killed her. That same night, coincidentally, Ava gets captured by her mom, turned into a vampire, and then locked away in her room inside of this town. And for years, Kai has been seeing Ava in her window, even though she's supposed to be gone, based on the story that her mom made up to cover her tracks. And Kai has a feeling that it was Ava who killed her mom. Several years later, Kai ends up becoming a flame witch and joining the sentries who guard this wall or barrier and also hunt vampires. So vampires end up coming into the town again. At the same time, Ava escapes, and Kai notices that Ava escapes, and she's determined to hunt her down. So for the rest of the book, we end up following Kai and Ava, who sort of team up under false pretenses to make it through this magical forest alive. And we see them go head to head. They're both very steadfast in their beliefs. Kai, especially, I think to most people, she'll come off as an unlikable character just because she is very proud. She doesn't like to be wrong. And she's also grieving her mother and is hell bent on revenge. On the other hand, Ava is very passive. She thinks the best of people. She thinks that people are good-natured and she just wants to do what's best for everyone. So she at times comes off as someone who is very impressionable or who will let people walk all over her. So it's an interesting dynamic because I think this is a book that if you like the characters, you will definitely enjoy the story. But if you don't like the characters, then you're gonna hate every second of it because they are the central characters. I ended up landing right in the middle. I gave it 3 stars. I really enjoyed seeing them learn from each other and get over their grief and their assumptions of each other and of the world that they were raised in. It's actually pretty action-packed throughout, so that made the story move very fast for me. So yeah, I thought it was a solid book and gave it 3 stars. The last and final book that I ended up reading in the first half of March is Lucha of the Night Forest by Tehlor K. Mejia. And this is the one book that I'm dreading to talk about because I gave it 1.5 stars, which feels very harsh and shocking. I think I rarely give books anything lower than 2 stars or 3 stars actually. But this is just a book that I didn't really enjoy reading. And on top of that, I think there were also a lot of just technical problems with the book. And it hurts me to say this because I think the concept for this is extremely creative and it's the concept of it, it's a young adult fantasy book. You have this magical forest that feels very whimsical but also dark, and then the town that it is set in feels very like steampunk, or at least that's the vibe that I got. And what I think ultimately didn't work for me with this particular book is that there were so many elements that were clashing, in particular the tone. Like I mentioned, some parts felt very young. Like I thought at some points it sounded like a middle grade book. It was very whimsical and very fluffy. Other parts were very grim and dark and bleak, and then other parts felt sort of in the middle where it felt like a young adult book, which it is. And I think part of what Tehlor wanted to do is really contrast that light versus dark, those elements really coming and blending in a book, but they were done in such a like harsh way that didn't quite blend together, and ultimately that just didn't work for me. Another thing that I also thought wasn't quite well done was the pacing of this book. There were chunks of time where so much happened, but it happened in like the span of a paragraph, when years went by, but very little was covered. And there was no immediate insight that that's what happened. And then there were times where maybe a couple of things happened and they happened within like the span of a few hours, but it took up like 2 or 3 chapters. So the space of like time and pacing was really off in this book, and it left me disoriented while I was already not quite enjoying the book. So it just dragged everything down. But essentially, what this book is about, we have two sisters, and they live in this town that is controlled by the ricos. The ricos not only own this town, but they're also responsible for trafficking this drug into the city called Olvido that makes people forget. Now, Lucha's mom has fallen victim of this drug, and so she has a special ability where she is sort of invisible to the creatures that roam the forest. They're not able to sense her, and because of this, she's able to go into the forest and hunt and then bring them back to town and basically keep her and her sister alive. But her mom is so far gone that they are on the verge of getting evicted from their home. It's at this time that her little sister decides to step up and she becomes sort of this like servant or maid to the ricos. But Lucha knows that this is really, really bad because she's probably going to be given drugs. So Lucha decides to team up with this mythical creature who's sort of a trickster that belongs to the forest in order to save her sister. And from there, they end up going on a quest together. So again, it has so many great, cool elements that I think would work so well together, and I was just extremely disappointed in the execution. It's a book that's super creative, really like all of the ideas, but the execution just didn't quite work for me. I don't know. I don't know. Have you read other books by Taylor K. Mejia? How did it work out for you? Because I just had a terrible experience, and I'm really sad to say that. Plans for the rest of the month to end on a good note. I'm currently reading A Storm of Swords, which is the third book in A Song of Ice and Fire. I'm trying to finish it before March ends. And then after that, I'm not quite sure what I'll be picking up next. There are a couple of books that I have from the library that will be due soon, so I want to try to get to them. But then I also have a couple of arcs from NetGalley, and I do want to try to prioritize them to read them before they're published. We'll see. We'll see. I don't know. I don't have plans right now except for finishing A Storm of Swords. Let me know down below how your reading plans are going. Are they going better than mine? Thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, leave a it's spring. Leave a palm tree emoji. I don't know why I thought of palm trees. Thanks for watching. Bye.